How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boil Eye Hobby Time. Let me ask you a question. What do these two things have in common? Well, for one, they're in the same scale. Two, they're both owned by Disney. And three, they both happen to be on my desk today. Other than that, very little. I pulled the Clone Trooper out of the box, along with all the runners in their plastic bags, and then I turned my attention to Nightcrawler. It's usually how I unbox my breakfast cereal. This Nightcrawler figure was sent to me by my internet friend Owain, and until recently I had never heard that name pronounced out loud. So last time I said Owain. I do apologize for the mispronunciation. Either way, Owain is a fan of X-Men and wanted to see a diorama of Nightcrawler teleporting, and today is my attempt at that. I chose the Clone Trooper because it was the best 1:12 scale figure that I had on hand to be sucker punched in the face, but I will leave him detachable and he will remain a placeholder until I can find a figure more appropriate. As is always the case with Bandai, the kit was a pleasure to put together. After all the individual body parts were ready, he basically did the rest of the assembly himself.
Brothers, we fight together.
To keep Kurt here in his mid-air punching position, I grabbed a metal tube and bent it into somewhat of a candy cane shape. Or I guess not somewhat, into a candy cane shape. I did this very gently so as not to crimp and compromise the rigidity. I cut off as much as I needed to and then got it firmly embedded in the base. Did this by first drilling a hole in the base and then supporting it underneath using an additional block of wood. I made sure to leave an ample amount of room between the bottom of the pipe and the base of the base so as not to block any wires that will be coming out of here later. I then switched my attention to the other end of the tube, the one going into Nightcrawler's back. I marked a location and drilled a hole. First with the Dremel, and then finally, just for good measure, I heated up the tube with a butane torch and I melted him into position. What this will do is cause the inside of that hole and the tube to essentially be a perfect fit. At this point, all of the joints still worked, which was great to get him into this position, but I didn't want him to look like an action figure with all of the visible gaps in the joints. I also didn't want him to move, so I flooded all of those joints with first plastic cement, which didn't work, so I used an extra thin super glue. He's now forever stuck in this position, and the next step was to fill all the gaps with a 2-part epoxy. Hi, pal. You need me to help you? Emergencies. After assisting my kiddo on the potty, I mixed up the putty and began filling all the seams and gaps in the joints. And before all the collectors jump in the comments freaking out about how I'm ruining this guy, just remember that if I decrease the value of this one, it increases the value of yours. I'm also just replacing that value with a different kind of value. This putty will take a nice long time to cure, so while we wait for that, let's move back to the base. Like I said before, the Clone Trooper is just a placeholder for now, but the base that he comes with has a snug little grip for a 1:12 scale foot. So I will leave that there for some time in the future when I replace him. This diorama will have lights, so I threw a battery housing under the base, which I glued and screwed in place. And I trimmed down the front of the base using my bandsaw and barely made it because of these awful little metal pieces in the corners. Somebody left those in there, probably as a practical joke or something. But that's good to remember for the future. Anyway, I used my Dremel to cut a hole for a switch. And I filled said hole with said switch, and then got the whole thing soldered together underneath the base. Next, I drilled a hole in the standoff where the wires will come through and supply power to the LEDs that make up the glowing portal. I threaded those down through the new hole in the standoff until everything was under the base, and then I essentially completed the circuit except for the LEDs. So I don't have to come back and do anything under here later on. Next, I moved to the platform that the Clone Trooper will be standing on, and to help even everything out, I cut up a sheet of corkboard. I drilled out a hole for that standoff and cut out another hole for the base of the Clone Trooper so that everything sat more or less flush. Once the holes had been cut, I glued that down to the base, and I grabbed some XPS foam offcuts and began carving some stones. Some nice big pointy stones that are generic enough that they could fit in any Disney-owned universe where this encounter could be taking place. After the rocks had been cut out, I gave them their final bit of rocky texture by impressing them with a pre-made resin rock. This is from the last batch that I made, the one that ruined my hobby mat. I glued those rocks down to the base using some foam-safe super glue, of course, and the next step was to break out the Sculpting mold. I'll use this to create the terrain and fill in and patch up all of the gaps so that it looks like one consistent piece of scenery. I masked off the spot where the foot will go, and then I applied my Sculpting mold, working it around the base, pretty much using my finger, but in a few cases between the rocks, there were some tight spaces where I had to use an additional tool. To protect the foam and give the surface a little more durability, I slapped on a coat of Mod Podge, and then this thing was ready to be set aside to dry. By this point, the epoxy putty on Nightcrawler was fully cured, so I did a little bit of trimming and sanding, and then it was time to repaint him. I started with a black primer over everything, followed by a light, almost white gray over the gloves and boots, and anything that wasn't going to be black. This was an essential step because it is very difficult to paint something like red consistently over black, without like a bajillion thin coats, that is. Speaking of red, that's what I applied next, which looked fairly pink when I first put it on. After a second coat, it was nice and red. It also got all over my hands when it jumped out of the airbrush for some reason. After that, I switched over to a brush to paint in all the details and establish some nice clean lines between all of the colors. I'm really happy with the way that turned out. As I was painting Nightcrawler here, I was thinking about the X-Men and their different abilities and wondering if I was a mutant, what would I want to be able to do? And honestly, it would be hard to beat teleportation or being telepathic. But I wouldn't necessarily want to be fully blue, like a Smurf, you know? But that does beg the question, is he blue because he's a mutant, or did he maybe consume too much colloidal silver? Because I have heard that actually happens to some people. The base was now dry, so I could move on to painting that as well. I gave it a coat of Martian red from the airbrush, followed by a dark tan for the rocks, followed by a sandy tan for the midtones, and an almost white tan for the highlights. Next, I painted the rim of the base with black, and I was okay with some overspray. So what that did was add a little bit of a vignetted look to the landscape. I was happy with the way that looked, so I took it outside and I gave it a clear coat with a matte varnish. With the painting done, I could then move on to the finishing steps, starting with gluing Nightcrawler in place. I mixed up a 2-part epoxy glue, stuck that on the end of the tube and into his back. Once that's fully cured, he will be essentially stuck there permanently. For the little cloud of purple smoke that appears every time Nightcrawler teleports, I broke out some magenta noodle filaments, also provided by Owain, as well as some armature wire, which I wrapped around the standoff and formed into the general shape of a cloud. The LED filaments are wrapped in silicone, which doesn't really stick to anything, so in order to get those to follow the path of the armature wire, I snipped up little pieces of clear heat shrink, and I used that to just grab it and hold it in place by force, rather than trying to use some kind of adhesive. After all 5 of the filaments were in position, I tested them to make sure I hadn't ruined them in the process. I soldered everything together, and it was time to add the cloud effect. I then broke out some polyester fiber fill. I wrapped that around the filaments and filled in all the other gaps. And off camera, I burnt away all the little loose strands. I did go back and add a little bit more, so I might have missed a few. And the last step was to darken all the furthest spots of cloud with the airbrush. And once my temporary placeholder clone trooper had been stuck in place, I called it good. that is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Appreciate Owain providing the figure and the inspiration for today's build. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.